Number 10. Treadmill Punishment. While getting on a treadmill today can feel like a punishment in itself, back in the Victorian era, prisoners were assigned to the treadmill as a real punishment. Yeah, you can't get off this one. You would think they're only making prisoners stronger, but there is a method behind this madness. Listen up. The treadmill was invented by Sir William Cubitt in 1818. The treadmill was used not only for grinding corn, but mainly as a punishment. Corn and punishments, my two favorite things. Prisoners would step on 24 spokes of a large paddle wheel, causing it to turn. While originally intended for productive work, it quickly became a form of punishment. Yeah, somebody saw it and was like, you know what? I know how to make this awful. Get on there. The repetitive physical strain of the treadmill made it one of the most dreaded among inmates. Just thinking about a treadmill right now is making my legs shake. Let's move on. Number 9. Amelia Dyer. During the Victorian era, rapid industrialization led to urban expansion, bringing with it increased disease, poverty, and unemployment. All those fun things that make a city. By 1856, the force had expanded to include inspectors tasked with investigating serious crimes. One notable event occurred in 1896 when reading detectives apprehended Amelia Dyer. She was convicted of multiple killings, the worst of the worst, the details of which I can't even say on YouTube or else our channel will get shut down. But the number of lives Amelia Dyer has taken, historians believe that number is around 400. 400, and a lot of them are quite young, by the way. Quite young. If it weren't for the Readingborough police force and that small team of officers, who knows how many more lives would have been lost by the hands of one Amelia Dyer. 8. Transportation. In the 1800s, courts were looking for alternatives to hanging that were harsher than fines but not as brutal as, well, being hanged. Transportation then emerged as a viable punitive option. Initiated in 1717, this practice involved sending convicts away, just sending them away to colonies primarily in Australia at the time, where over 165,000 were transported over 80 years. Now, initially, convicts were housed on decrepit warships with a high mortality rate, of course due to unsanitary conditions, but the majority of those transported were male, ranging from quite young, again, very young, to individuals that were over 80. It could be anyone, these boats were crazy. The journey often included stops in Gibraltar, the West Indies, South America, or the Cape of Good Hope to resupply provisions before reaching various Australian settlements. To which they go, you, get out. Okay, let's do it. Number 7, the crank. Oh, the crank. It sounds easy, but you give it time. Prisoners often endured hard labor such as breaking stones or turning the crank machine, which was a handle that convicts had to turn thousands of times a day, and often for no purpose other than punishment. Yeah, it's like a wheel that'll, not a wheel, it's like a, this is a blooper, me going, it's like a, it's like those old cars where you had to roll the window down manually. It took you like 7.5 minutes. You're like, come on, I'm so hot. There we go, we found it. An example is the case of Oscar Wilde, who was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor for gross indecency. Now, his prison experience, especially the hard labor, drastically affected his health and literary productivity. So far, this one here sounds the worst. At least with the treadmill, you got a little bit stronger over time. There's some sort of payoff. But turning a crank for no reason at all, I mean, maybe your one arm would get jacked, but other than that, you're just gonna destroy your body for no reason at all. What a nightmare. The scold's bridle was a sinister instrument of public humiliation from the Victorian era. Now this one really sucked, I'm not gonna lie. We're gonna start cranking it up here, no pun intended. The device was used to punish unruly women who were accused of nagging or gossiping. Yeah, you talk to your friend, now you got the scold's bridle. Enjoy. The scold's bridle resembled an iron cage almost. The bridle enclosed the head of the accused, while some versions featured a spiked or studded plate that was inserted into the mouth to suppress speech and causing, of course, excruciating pain if the wearer attempted to continue to gossip or talk. They were often paraded through the streets and the victim was subjected to public ridicule and scorn. Yeah, scorn. You ever been scorned before? That sucks. Turning the scold's bridle into a dreadful symbol of enforced silence and societal control over women's voices and opinions. This one looks like a saw trap too. This was pretty brutal. It should have been number 1 if anything.
Next up on our list today we have the drunkard's cloak. Speaking of shame, this was one method that definitely worked to embarrass anyone out of committing this crime, and it also showed that maybe the Victorians had a bit of a sense of humor, although a very morbid one. So imagine you're in a bustling town square and there's someone looking quite ridiculous and moving awkwardly among the crowd. This poor soul is decked decked out in the infamous drunkard's cloak, which is basically a barrel turned into a heavy, uncomfortable garment. Think of it as the original cone of shame, but for humans. This barrel, often with holes for the arms and head, turned public drunks into walking spectacles. Walking around in this bulky, clunky barrel made any movement a challenge and attracted all kinds of stares, snickers, and maybe even a few rotten tomatoes from onlookers. This cloak wasn't just a punishment, it was a public statement. I partied too hard, and look where it got me. Designed to shame the wearer and entertain the public, the drunkard's cloak was a bizarre blend of punishment and street theater. So next time you're thinking about overdoing it at happy hour, just be thankful you're not doing so in a time when the hangover could involve navigating the local market in a barrel. That would be horrible. Next up on our list, we have the silent system. Imagine stepping into a Victorian era prison and hearing absolutely nothing. That would be so creepy, right? And that is the silent system for you. Introduced as a shiny new way to keep prisoners from corrupting each other with their criminal chatter, this system took solitary confinement up a notch. Inmates were not only isolated, but were also required to remain completely silent. The idea was that the silence would help them reflect on their crimes and reform. Sounds noble in theory maybe, but in practice it was a lot more like psychological torture. The utter lack of conversation, the inability to express any thoughts or feelings often drove prisoners to the brink of madness. This eerie quiet was intended to cleanse their moral palate, but instead it often led to severe mental breakdowns. Talk about a punishment that leaves you speechless, literally and figuratively. Next up, we are talking about the body. So imagine being punished for a brutal crime only to have your punishment last into and after your death. It sounds kind of extreme, right? Well, back in the Victorian era, for some particularly nasty crimes, the punishment didn't just stop with their last breath. Nope, back in the day, the justice system had a bit of a flair for the dramatic and the downright macabre. So after the execution, they might prop up the criminal's body for all to see, turning it into a public spectacle. Talked about this a little bit, thinking of it as a chilling warning sign like behave or this could be you. But wait, it gets even more gruesome. Sometimes they'd even dissect the body. Yeah, I don't know why. They'd slice it open, pull it apart, often in front of an audience. This wasn't just for science, it was showbiz, Victorian style. It was like their way of saying the law had not only the power to take your life, but also to command your body after death. A reminder that the justice system held all the cards, making sure the memory of your deeds lived on as a lesson for everyone else. Next up on our list, we are talking about the shot drill. Okay, so you're in a Victorian era prison yard and there's no gym, but there's plenty of what you might call forced fitness. Enter the shot drill, a grueling exercise that could make even the toughest gym class look like an absolute walk in the park. Imagine lugging a hefty cannonball, hoisting it up to your chest with both hands, and then shuffling across the prison yard to drop it off at the other end. Sounds pretty tough, right? So now picture doing that just over and over again from sun up to sundown. This wasn't just about keeping prisoners busy or whatever, it was back-breaking work meant to drain their energy and break their spirits. The shot drill was the Victorian penal system's way of adding insult to injury, keeping you physically exhausted and constantly reminded of your captive state. Talk about a heavy day's work. Imagine doing all of that, so you gotta do all of those drills with a cannonball also, like we had nothing else, and then you gotta go inside and just be quiet after that. You just can't talk at all. That would just suck. Okay, I don't know, man. I really don't think I would have done well in the Victorian era. Okay, and finally on our list today, we have oakum picking. So imagine, again, you're a prisoner in the Victorian era, sentenced to oakum picking. Sounds like something kind of out of a craft fair, but way better than that shot drill sentence. Well, maybe not quite. Imagine sitting there day after day, tearing apart old, tar-soaked ropes that used to hold ships together. Your task is to pull these gritty, sticky ropes apart until all that's left are the fibers, which then get reused to plug up leaks in ships, or stuff the very mattress you might be sleeping on, if you can call it sleeping. This isn't just tough on the mind, it is brutal on the hands. As you separate these fibers, your hands start to cramp, ache, and even bleed, thanks to the relentless, jagged edges of the rope. And just when you think you can't take another minute, you realize that your shift is not even close to being over. Oakum picking isn't just a job, it's a test of endurance, turning each day into a gritty battle against ropes that seem as tough as the life you are trying to survive.
So we'll start with punishment 1, tattooing. You may have seen our video, the top 10 messed up punishments from the Tokugawa era, in which case tattoos as punishment may sound familiar. While Japan and China were on different wavelengths and doing their own things, this is something they had in common for criminals. Although tattooing has been known in China for centuries, it has been in the most part an uncommon practice outside of their indigenous peoples. Throughout Chinese history, tattooing has been seen as a deformation of the body, something undesirable, and this originates likely with the penal tattooing as one of the 5 capital punishments in ancient China. The first, and considered the lightest of the 5 punishments, had criminals' upper cheeks or forehead or other visible parts of the body tatted up. It was usually words that described their misdemeanors or the location of their exile or name of their hard labor camp. These tattoos are obviously permanent and very visibly marked out their bearers as ex-criminals for life. Even should the criminal ever return from exile, the tattoo would mark them as what they were. The Kinlaw Code covered so many offenses that common people frequently did not realize they had committed a crime until they'd been arrested. So you really could be just minding your business one day and boom, face tat the next. Next is amputations. So after tattoos, the next was rhinotomy, aka the snip of a criminal's nose. Like tattooing, it left the victim scarred for life. But because sharp items and blood were involved, rhinotomy and the next 2 penalties following after often resulted in death, even if not their intention, just due to things like bleeding out or infections. Then, level 3 is amputation of feet, aka you. Modern day scientists have been examining a skeleton that was found from 3,000 years ago where the foot of a woman was cut off as punishment for committing a criminal act. Various clues hint that the woman's foot was cut off as a ewe. Her bones show no signs of any disease that could have made such an amputation necessary, and it seems that the injury was roughly made, rather than with the precision of a medical amputation. There were variations in punishments in different periods where the choice of foot removed depended on the severity of the crimes committed. Amputation of the right foot for a very serious crime, and the left for lighter offenses. It would seem that the woman, who was determined to be in her early 30s when she died, had committed the former. There is extensive historical evidence of the practice of the third punishment, such as documents of a Chinese official in the millennium BC complaining about the demand to find special shoes for their amputee people. Remove the reproductives. Called gong, the permanent removal of a person's reproductive function. Male victims of this punishment were castrated, losing the member as well as their boys. A very famous casualty was Sima Qian, an emasculated father of traditional Chinese history writing. Gong punishments for female victims were harder, as in the older times they didn't really know what was going on all up in there or how to access it, so it might have involved pounding a woman's abdomen with a stout stick to introduce some kind of damage to the womb. Call that whack a womb, I guess? But no? No, alright. Then the final in the code, the last of the 5 punishments, was death, obviously. However, there were different variations of death, from simple strangulation or decapitation to boiling or grilling a person alive and making literal mincemeat out of a person's flesh and then salting it. They got gorgeous with it, guys. The cruelty was deliberate and designed to cause maximum pain to the victims and their families, as well as to shock and deter others from committing similar crimes. A criminal might be sentenced to death by strangulation if less punitive, or decapitation if more punitive. Strangulation was actually prescribed sentence for lesser crimes, lodging an accusation against one's parents or grandparents, scheming to kidnap a person and sell them, opening a coffin while desecrating a tomb. Decapitation was a method of execution prescribed for more serious crimes such as treason or sedition. Despite a great discomfort involved, most of the Chinese people actually preferred strangulation to decapitation in the ancient times, and this is the result of the traditional belief that the body is a gift from the parents and that it is therefore disrespectful to one's ancestors to die without returning one's body to the grave intact. Executions were usually carried out at 11:30 a.m. On the day of the execution, the convict would be carted from the jail cell to the execution grounds. The cart stopped at a wine shop named the Broken Bull on the east side of the Zuanwu Gate, where the convict would be offered a bowl of rice wine. The bowl would be smashed after it was drunk oppa, and then the heads chopped off and promptly sent to the emperor. Now finished with the 5 official punishments, let's check out some other horrors, like the Kango, a type of large wooden collar placed around the necks of offenders, which could weigh differently depending on the severity of their crimes. Speaking of which, the Chinese Empire really said, and we have the receipts for it too guys, as the criminals' past crimes would be attached to the wooden collar, most of the time for the public to see, grocery list style. The Kango also restricted a person's movements, so it was common for people wearing Kangoos to starve to death as they were unable to feed themselves and sometimes not even move from one place. If people were generous enough to offer food to the roadside Kango wearers, they could also see the list of their crimes and determine based off of that if they deserved their generosity at all. After all, it was a device used for public humiliation and corporal punishment. Imagine seeing someone you've beefed with forever pop up one day on the street corner wearing one of these. You can just walk up and read everything they did wrong, just attached to them. That's satisfaction for a grudge holder, man.
Number 5, rats. They really do love using rats back in the day, but to be honest, you'd be surprised that they use rats even as recent as 1970s in Chile and Argentina during the Dirty War using the same methods. The method, if some might know, involved trapping rats in a bottomless cage atop a victim's abdomen. Burning coals were then placed on a small tray atop the cage, heating the metal from above. Desperation to escape the heat, the rats would begin to burrow only through the soft surface that they could find, which is the victim's flesh. With sharp claws and teeth, the rats would quickly gnaw their way into the victim's bowels, causing excruciation, pain, and terror. The technique particularly came in handy when, as I mentioned before, the Dutch leaders were trying to extract information from Spanish enemies. As soon as the caged rats were placed on the prisoner's stomach, the terrified men would often give up and they would actually just expose everything else that they knew. Number 4, stoning. Stoning or lapidation is a form of capital punishment where a group throws stones at a person until the subject dies from a blunt trauma. It has been attested as a form of punishment from grave misdeeds since ancient times. Stoning is attested in the Near East since ancient times as a form of capital punishment for grave sins. However, stoning as a practice was not geographically limited to only near the East, as it is also a significant historical record of stoning being employed in the West as well. Ancient geographers describe both the elder and younger atrocities being stoned to death in ancient Greece around the 7th century BCE. Stoning is condemned by human rights groups as a form of cruel and unusual punishment and torment as a serious violation of human rights. As of now, human rights organizations argue that many acts targeting of stoning should not be legal in the first place. By allowing them interferes with people's rights to private life. Number 3, Brazen Bull. Throughout history, humans in general have created an enclave of many extraordinary things. One of the cruelest punishments invented in ancient Greece, this particular type of torment was just as pleasant as everything else on this list, or rather unpleasant. The Brazen Bull was just that of a sculpture of a bull with a fire built underneath it. The victim was placed inside and slowly roasted to death as the fire burned and the metal grew hotter and hotter. I'm pretty sure you can imagine the pain of the victims that they were in, so that the creators of the Brazen Bull would just enjoy it. The bull was casted hollow and was used with a fire built below, and it was designed so that it could be opened and a person would be forced inside. As I mentioned, the fire would start underneath and the person would be burnt as the smoke and steam would escape through the nose. Incense was also placed inside to counteract the smell of burning flesh, and it is said that the series of tubes inside the statue was designed to distort the screams of the victims to make it sound like an animal. Once the individual had succumbed into their charred state, apparently the people there would also use their bones and turn them into bracelets. Number 2, the rack. The rack was a torment device consisting of a rectangular frame with a roller at each end. The victim's limbs were stretched and tied to the rollers. By turning the rollers, the body would be subjected to increasing tension, causing extreme pain and potential dislocation or dismemberment of their joints. The exact origin of the rack is pretty unclear, but the earliest mention of its use was in ancient Greece. The rack was often used as a torment method to extract confession, with the execution itself coming anyway from another method. Nevertheless, victims would perish on the rack, and for those who did not, it was far more likely more painful for the persecutor to the method of actual execution. The most infamous case of the rack as it used in ancient Greece was associated with Herostratus, an arsonist who was set on fire to the second temple of Artemis in Ephesus in 356 BC. Finally, number 1, crucifixion. This form of execution was mostly associated with the death of Jesus, was rather practiced in ancient Greece, but there is at least one mention in the historical text of the Greeks condemning someone to this slow and excruciating death. According to the Greek writer Herodotus in his histories, there's an account of the execution of a Persian general by the Athenians around 479 BC. The Persians had burned Athens just a year prior in 480 BC, so the harsh punishment may have reflected the intense anger of the Greeks. In any case, Herodotus wrote that they nailed him to a plank and hung him, and this, as you know, is the form of crucifixion.
Alrighty, let's dive into the grim yet fascinating world of Victorian era hangings with a bit of a casual twist. Imagine a time when Netflix wasn't around and people needed some form of entertainment. Gruesome as it may sound, public hangings were kind of like the morbid blockbusters of the Victorian era. Now, hanging wasn't just a drop in the park, it was a go-to showstopper for very serious crimes. Think of it as the ultimate deterrent, a stark warning that crime doesn't pay, especially not in an era where stealing a loaf of bread could land you in a world of trouble. It went a little something like this. A town crier announces the upcoming execution. I would love to be a town crier. Oh my god. Those guys had all the tea. Just going and yelling at everybody. Oh I really wanted to do a town crier impersonation, but I just can't yell in here. Chris's ears would explode. A town crier announces the upcoming execution. Flyers are posted and word spreads like wildfire. On the big day, people flock from far and wide, creating a carnival-like atmosphere. There are vendors selling snacks, folks jostling for the best view, and an air of anticipation that's hard to miss. The condemned, often paraded through the streets, would then face their final curtain on the gallows, a platform designed for the very purpose of ending lives. The executioner, sometimes hooded, would place the rope around the prisoner's neck, a process watched with bated breath by the crowd. A quick pull of the lever and it was all over. But here's a twist in the tale. Public executions weren't just about punishment, they were also seen as moral lessons. Live action morality plays meant to instill fear and promote good behavior. Yet, the spectacle sometimes backfired. Sympathies occasionally swayed towards the unfortunate soul on the gallows, especially if the crowd deemed their crime petty or their behavior sympathetic. By 1868, Britain decided this was all a bit too much for public sensibilities and moved executions behind the solemn walls of prisons, away from the public's prying eyes and picnics. So next time you're queuing for the latest movie or binge watching a series, spare a thought for the Victorians, for whom a day out might have just involved a bit of gallows theater, complete with real life drama, tragedy, and unfortunately no encore for the star of the show. Ooh. Alright, next up on our list we have flogging. Spare the rod and spoil the child. If you've heard this phrase before, imagine it being taken to the extreme, as they often did in the Victorian era. Flogging wasn't just a quick slap on the wrist, it was a full-on event with the person typically tied up and given a set number of lashes that could leave scars for life. This punishment wasn't exclusive to hardened criminals. Oh no, even some of the more vulnerable members of our communities could get a taste of the whip for acting up. And soldiers or sailors might find themselves on the receiving end for stepping out of line. The idea was that a good thrashing could correct any number of moral or disciplinary issues. Sounds pretty harsh, right? Well, that was Victorian justice for you. Very much about making the punishment fit the crime with a side of public humiliation to ensure you'd think twice before stepping out of line again. Next up on our list today we have the debtor's prison. Imagine a world where you've just run out of luck with your finances and bam, you're sent off to a debtor's prison, which is about as fun as it sounds. So, not fun at all. These places were grim. Think of the worst hotel you've ever seen, then remove any windows, heating, or good food. In debtor's prison, you were stuck until your debt was paid off, but here's where things get even more interesting. How in the world are you supposed to settle your debts when you're locked up and you can't work? It's kind of like trying to run a marathon with your legs tied together. Meanwhile, your family on the outside, yeah, forgot about them, they're just scrambling to get by without their main money earner, which often plunged them into their own financial crisis. Love that. It was just a vicious cycle that didn't do much for actually solving the problem of debt. Instead, it just added a hefty dose of misery and despair to the mix. It sounds like the Victorian era was actually just a lot of that. Misery and despair. So next time you're fretting about paying bills, just be thankful you're not doing it Victorian style, I guess. Or else I'd be in Rogers prison for my phone bill. Next up, we have the scold's bridle. Back in the Victorian era, if a woman was labeled a bit too chatty or opinionated, heaven forbid she actually nag, she might find herself in the not so stylish accessory known as the scold's bridle. Imagine a heavy, clunky metal mask clamping over your head, complete with a gag right in your mouth to put the kibosh on any further chit-chat. Okay, not exactly the pinnacle of fashion or comfort, right? This contraption wasn't just about silencing, it was the 19th century version of public shaming with a generous dash of misogyny. Women were paraded around, their speech literally bridled as a warning to others that speaking out of turn wasn't just frowned upon, it was punishable. Thankfully, we've relegated such barbaric practices to the history books, but the scold's bridle remains a stark reminder of how far we've come in understanding and respecting individual rights and voices. Moving on down our list, we are talking about transportation next. Imagine you're living in 19th century Britain and things are frankly pretty bleak if you're not wearing a top hat and tails. Now imagine you've been caught stealing a loaf of bread or, heaven forbid, a handkerchief. The punishment? Well, you're not just going to the local jail, you're being shipped off to the other side of the world. Transportation meant being packed off to Australia or Tasmania, places that were as remote and alien as the moon for many Brits at the time. These were no pleasure cruises. The journey alone could take months on cramped, disease-ridden ships where survival was a coin toss. Once you arrived, if you were still kicking, congratulations! Your prize was hard labor in brutal conditions, often in chain gangs or remote outposts where the sun seemed to have a personal vendetta against you. And forget about a leisurely pint at the pub, you were there to work, building the infrastructure for new colonies, often in sweltering heat or other extreme conditions. Speaking of hard labor, the good old Victorian era where they took no pain, no gain to a whole new level, especially in prisons. So imagine you've been nabbed for stealing a loaf of bread, and yes, this is the only example I will be using like I'm Jean Valjean himself. So imagine you stole the bread and bam, you're sentenced to hard labor. And we're not talking about breaking a sweat at the gym, we're diving into the world of the treadmill and the crank machine. Victorian style gym equipment from your worst nightmare. Imagine being stuck on a never-ending stairmaster, the treadmill, not for your health, but as punishment, climbing to nowhere for hours. Then there's the crank machine, a mind-numbing device that had prisoners turn a crank a mind-blowing number of times just to complete their daily quota. And for what? Absolutely nothing. No purpose, no product, just pure fatigue and despair. It was the era's twisted way of teaching a lesson, breaking spirits under the guise of building character. So next time you moan about your gym routine, just remember it could have been a Victorian prison workout, alright? It's not so bad. You got this. Just a couple more flights of stairs. I don't know, I'm turning into David Goggins here. I almost called him Jimmy Goggins for some reason. I don't know where that came from. Okay, anyway.
Imagine a time and a place where asking some folks, hey, you want to get dinner and drinks, would get you executed. The Han food restrictions. The Han dynasty had some fickle little food laws and regulations, it appears, and for some reason they had wild punishments for them. For example, the law stipulates that dinner without a valid reason will be fined if caught, and if there's beef on the table, it will be cut directly. Does that do something to the beef? I don't get that part. I also don't get the part where between 206 BC BC and 220 CE, having a few drinks with the boys could get you literally decapitated. The law stated that if 3 or more people got together to drink, the participants would be fined 4 tals of gold. If you're unable to pay, obviously you face severe consequences, because why can you afford to drink but not pay a fee? The only exception to this rule were gatherings such as weddings, funerals, and festivals. Many rulers and dynasties attempted to regulate the consumption of alcohol, in some part because making alcohol required grains like rice, and that supply was often short. Rulers also feared that drunken civilians could easily turn disorderly and violent and cause some peace issues. Can't talk unusual and freaky without bringing up the Mongols and their Yasa law. The Yasa decrees are only available to us through secondary sources, as there's no comprehensive Mongol scroll or codex found so far. Naturally, this can be problematic, and our knowledge of Yasa law is nothing like the older code of Hammurabi. This is due to the fact they weren't literate, so yeah, the laws were told verbally. What we know of Yasa, declared by Genghis himself, is it concerned itself with people, not property, and aimed for 3 things: obedience to Genghis Khan, a binding together of nomenclats, and merciless punishment of wrongdoing. Nowadays, we've managed to collect some of their laws together, and I'm gonna read you some of this list. So, we have urinating in water or ashes is punishable by death. One may not dip their hands into water and must instead use a vessel for drawing water. Probably a hygiene thing, but at least it's not death, you know? It's forbidden to wash clothing until completely worn out, and don't forget, when you do go to wash them, it's forbidden to bathe or wash garments in running water during thunder. I can't make sense of that one. And then also there's the one where parents can arrange a marriage between their children even if one or both are already dead. But the weirdest thing aren't even the articles, it's the penalties. Only death is ever specified as a consequence. Adultery, death. Take someone against their will, death. Peeing in water, death. Don't answer con calls, death. Giving out food or clothing captives, death. Death, 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 death. Now, it also includes some pretty chill laws, like Genghis ordered that all religions to be respected and no preference be shown to any of them. So, I mean, you win some, you lose some. Up next is like country boys at Boots and Hearts. You gotta chug, chug, chug. This law and punishment comes to us from the Sui dynasty of China, which the duration was 581 to 618 BC. If you've seen some of my videos about ancient China, you may know that getting into the royal court for work could be pretty blessed for you, your biddy, and any kids or family you have. Some parents went as far as to snip their kids' junk so they could potentially be a eunuch for their emperor in the future. If you don't want to do that, you could always take the imperial exam, the Keiju, which theoretically allows anyone in the country to become a government official. But failing the test was not without consequence, especially if you weren't neat. According to the Book of Sui, the official historical records of the Sui dynasty, the laws stipulated that examinees with bad handwriting would be punished by being forced to drink 1 sheng of ink, aka a literal liter. Don't think you can drop out either once you learn that and you know you can't improve your handwriting in time. The penalty for dropping out is also to chug down some ink. Why so extreme over some exams? Well, exam answers were in theory written by the emperor, even though in practice his officials would be the ones doing the grading. So even if the emperor didn't see it, bad handwriting indicated disrespect to him, the son of heaven. Also, if you failed the examination, guess what your punishment is? Drink some more ink. Had to throw something violently nauseating in on this list at some point, so we got death by Dumbo. This is gonna be rough, you guys, and it makes it obvious colonies of Asia were not effing around. Hope you're ready. So, elephants were used to crush and even gore criminals to death in medieval South and Southeast Asia. This method was popular in India from the Mughal period into the late 19th century. The criminals were laid down either face down, a blessing, I imagine, or face up to see their incoming demise, which was wild, angry elephants, who ran over them repeatedly, ensuring a quick yet very painful death. The most common form, however, was mano a mano, when a convict was laid down and an elephant walked over to the execution site by the handlers and deliberately made to stamp on the torso or head. Elephants are clever creatures, and reportedly they could be taught to slice and gore criminals to death with pointed blades fitted to their tusks. Imagine an elephant in a blind rage running at you with butcher knives duct taped to its tusks, because that's literally what their last moments would have been like. Alright, let's talk mud now. Not any old mud, it's mud. The glorious mud. Gonna say mud way too much, it's gonna feel made up. So, execution by suffocation was a common practice of the ancients. Look at hanging, or wax stuff, like water torment. However, in the medieval period, a very strange kind of suffocation technique was used called mud, the glorious mud. And yes, you have to say it like that, so follow me on screen. Mud, the glorious mud. Yay! Okay, I'll stop. So, some historians tell us that criminals would be killed by throwing him or her into a pit of stinky mud, usually also packed with human filth and feces because this is medieval Europe. The convict would either die by drowning or by suffocation. However, this was also a common accidental death for the exhausted armor-laden soldiers laying injured on battlefields. Anyways, being drowned or suffocated in mud for punishment does seem to have been rare, thankfully, primarily known to happen in the Burgundy region of France, where it was a punishment reserved specifically for women who left their husbands.
Number 10. Stuck in the middle. The pillory consisted of hinged wood boards forming holes through which the head and or various limbs were inserted, and the boards were locked together to secure the captive. Pillories were set up to hold people in marketplaces, crossroads, and other public places. They're often held on platforms to increase public visibility of the person, and often a plate card detailing the crime that was placed nearby. These punishments generally lasted only for a few hours, but by then you would want to contact your therapist by using BetterHelp, or if you're lucky in a country with free healthcare, contact your doctor for a psych eval. In being forced to bend over forward and stick your head through and your hands out in front of them, offenders in the pillory would have been extremely uncomfortable during their punishment. However, the main purpose in putting criminals in the pillory was to humiliate them in public. On discovery that the pillory was occupied, people would get excited as they would gather in the marketplace to taunt, tease, and laugh at the offender on display. Those who gathered to watch the punishment typically wanted to make the offender's experience a little bit more unpleasant as possible, because why wouldn't they? As it was in their form of entertainment. If you were poor and didn't have a job, you might as well take some of the time of your day off and throw tomatoes at someone that can't fight back. Number 9. Just to trim. Shaving one's head has actually been used as a form of punishment for centuries. From ancient times to modern day, it has been used to shame, humiliate, and punish individuals for various reasons. However, the effects of this punishment can be severe and long-lasting. And in these times, they would also shave one's head before carrying them out to other punishments. For example, heretics, citizens who criticized their leaders, or in most cases the king or emperor, etc., or even women who committed adultery, they would be forcibly gotten their head shaved, almost as a public display of showing of shame for their treason. The psychological impact of shaving one's head as a punishment can be traumatic, as it could lead to low self-esteem, depression, and anxiety. In some cases, it can even lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, aka PTSD. For some people, it might not seem like that scary as a punishment, but it is still a form of humiliation even used today. It's used as a punishment for minor offenses in some cultures, as well as punishment in schools and in prisons. Because of this, it leads to a culture of fear and oppression. Shaving heads without one's consent is a punishment and a violation of human rights and dignity, as it violates the rights of privacy and personal autonomy. Number 8. Flogging. When it comes to another form of public punishment, some might be subjected into flogging or being whipped in public. Typically, flogging has been imposed as an unwilling subject as a punishment. However, it can also be submitted to willingly, and even done by oneself in a sadomasochistic or religious context. Offenders could be subjected to beatings with implements like a whip or a rod, which were meant to be causing pain and severe as a deterrent. In the Dark Ages, the Whipping Act was passed in England in 1530. Under this legislation, vagrants were taken to a nearby populated area, and they would be tied by the end of a cart naked and beaten with whips throughout the town till the body should be very bloody. Although most of the whippings are typically done where the victim is wrapped around a pillar with their back exposed, there's also another thing called foot whipping, where one's feet are exposed. In some countries, this punishment of foot whipping is still executed in public to this day. Number 7. Marked. In forms of corporal punishment from temporary to more permanent, involving the following on the list. Although in some cultures, tattooing isn't seen as a bad thing, but to other heritage is a source of pride, but in some cases they're also used in means of marking an individual for their shame. Nathaniel Hawthorne, the Scarlet Letter, famously marked its protagonist, Hester Prynne, with a red letter A for adultery after accusations about her behavior. Hawthorne's book is more about fiction, as adulterers were really forced to mark their clothing to identify their crime. Like Hester Prynne, A, or the letters AD, as outlined by Plymouth Colony law from 1658, adulterers were seen publicly without their letters were subjected to public whipping and even more humiliation and social alienation. The humiliation can be extended intentionally or not by leaving visible marks such as scars. This can be a main intention of the punishment, as in this case of scarifications such as human branding. Number 6. Tis but a scratch. The medieval era's definition of period between the civilization of antiquity and the rational humanization of Renaissance is strongly associated with uncontrolled emotional violence both within and outside the judicial systems in the place at the time. Mutilation, by contrast, involves the removal or irreparable disfigurement by any means of making small portions of one of those larger sections of a living or dead person. The latter would include castration, removing of one's private parts, evisceration, removing of internal organs, and flaying, which is removal of someone's skin. With a split nose or the brand of the city on your forehead, not only had you endured a painful experience, but everyone could see for the rest of your life that you had committed a crime. The reason this barbaric penalty was sought out was to avert heavier punishments like the death penalty, but even methods that do result in a death penalty do not avail lightly to those receiving the punishment.
Punishment number 5 is blown asunder. This was the advent of British colonialists who tormented India in the 18th and 19th centuries. Blowing from a G word I can't say on YouTube involved the condemned being tied in front of a cannon so that the small of their back was forced against the muzzle. Their arms and legs would be tied tied behind them. The rope pulled taut enough that it curves their limbs back behind them uncomfortably. The cannon would then be fired, pretty much obliterating the prisoner's abdominal portion and blowing them in half. Bonus points for all the guts raining down on everyone. One contemporary observer reported that a head was blown almost 50 feet in the air once, and limbs sometimes landed 100 yards away, and the rest of the body essentially just vaporized. Punishment number 4 is torn apart. Another colonial classic. This style of death sentence is found everywhere from Rome to medieval Britain to Persia. For those unfamiliar with this punishment, you'd have your 4 limbs tied either between 2 horses, one holding both arm ropes and holding both leg ropes, or it'd be 1 horse for each of your limbs. At the count of 3, all horseback riders would take off in opposite directions and rip the person in the center apart. In ancient India, however, instead of using horses, they used oxen. For example, a law was in place that women caught killing their husbands or family members, killing others by poison, or committing arson are to be torn apart by oxen. Punishment number 3 is cooked alive. The sensation of being boiled alive was an absolutely horrific one, yet it was a punishment for things as meager as theft or lying. A large cauldron was filled with water, oil, tar, fat, or molten lead and left to boil. Putting a victim in the cauldron before the boiling was done was the worst way to exert this punishment, as it meant they would probably remain conscious, and then he'd notice his eyes burning, clothes fusing with his body, and skin blistering. The limbs and extremities were the first things to burn after that. After the person's outer layers began to cook, their organs began to cook as well, and their bodily fluids rose in temperature, so they were also boiling inside. All who went through this medieval death could only pray for a fast and merciful one, but boiling to death was unfortunately a very slow process. A quick death would only come, as said, if the liquid was already boiling when the victim is dunked in. If it wasn't and they wanted to speed up their own deaths, the victim could always duck their head underneath the liquid and just boil their own brain that way. But otherwise, it was long and horrific until the very end. While this should have been reserved for only the worst offenders, it soon became a go-to death sentence for foragers of all people. In India, it was said in the Garuda Puranam that the people who didn't offer food to orphans and contaminated food are boiled in oil after their death. In 1606, Guru Arjan of the Sikhs was boiled alive as a form of torment and subsequently died on the orders of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. Punishment number 2 is exposure. While this was less common in ancient India, it was part of other punishments such as pillory, whipping posts, or stocks, or it was used as a method of gaining confession. Victims could be exposed to the elements by restraining them somewhere outside, whether on the ground, which was more susceptible to bugs, pests, animals, and grime, or somewhere suspended, like a cage, off a wall. That one was popular in Europe. In summer, the guards could just pour hot water over the victim's head repetitively, which eventually increased body temperatures to the extent that heat stroke would take effect, causing a victim to die slowly and painfully. Sometimes the body was even left to decay publicly to dissuade any further crimes. During cold days and nights, the chill, as well as the lack of protection from the wind, could easily sap a victim's body heat. Alternatively, the victim could be buried up to his neck, letting any animals, insects, or other people kill him slowly the way they want to. Due to its cost efficiency and cruelty, the exposure torment strategy was widespread in medieval Europe and many other places. In many cases, the victim was sentenced to a short period of exposure depending on the crime. However, death was frequent since they were completely defenseless, even if it wasn't intended to be more than a 2-day punishment. You never know. Punishment number 1 is immurement. However, it is more identifiable to the common person if I just call it being buried alive. Placing someone into a confined space and then sealing it up so they're forced to wait for their own death, whether it comes from dehydration, starvation, or even asphyxiation. Immurement also had been performed for aesthetic reasons in Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, and examples can be found in plenty of written sources. The year is 1660 and the place is India. On the 6th of May, Shah Shuja, the second son of the Mughal emperor, boarded a ship and sailed from Dhaka to Arakan to find asylum from his brother, who was now his father's successor and wanted to kill him. Shah's plan was to stay in Arakan for a short period before sailing over to Mecca, then Persia. But he landed there just as the monsoon season hit, and it trapped the prince in Arakan for many months. And then for life. See, while stuck there, the king asked Shah if his eldest daughter would marry his son. For some reason, this really grilled Shah's onions, and he tried to overthrow the Arakan king in a coup, which then was found out. Although Shah managed to escape into the jungle, he was subsequently caught and put to death. The prince's family, however, were thrown into prison after their capture, although they were set free later. Moreover, the king married Shah's eldest daughter himself. He didn't even give her to his son, really just spit on dad's grave like that. But it seems like the surviving family members of Shah, including that eldest daughter, plotted to seize power again and overthrow the king, having clearly learned nothing. Like the last time the conspiracy was leaked, and this time the king meant business. If his family was going to keep being a problem, he was just going to exterminate the entire thing. According to the 17th century French physician and traveler Francois Bernard, the men were decapitated with axes, whilst the women were closed, confined in their apartments, left to die of hunger. All the windows and doors had been sealed. Even Shah's eldest daughter, now the king's wife, was not spared.
Number 10. Agent Orange. The vile war in Vietnam was brutal as the spread of violence echoed throughout each neighboring village. Agent Orange is a highly toxic chemical herbicide used by the United States as part of their onslaught against the Vietnamese. According to the US, they stated it was an herbicide to specifically clear vegetation in the dense forests and jungles of Vietnam, as well as the neighboring countries like Laos and Cambodia. Due to the fact that American forces were having difficulty finding Vietnamese troops in the forest, they chose to use this highly toxic chemical that not only destroyed their ecosystem but had caused tremendous health issues in the civilians that were caught in between the line of fire. Military personnel on both ends had experienced a long range of health issues, including various skin conditions, cancers, neurological disorders, as well as women in Vietnam experienced birth defects and miscarriages, as there was a significant number of birth defects in their offspring. 2.18 million gallons of Agent Orange was used in Vietnam, and even though there had been multiple addresses of the United States' reckless decision on using toxic gases, Dow Chemical Company, who sold the herbicide to the military, denied all liability and said no danger to human health. And like all injustices, the Circuit Court of Appeals dismissed the suit. And sure, some of the US veterans and their families got compensation, but still many of them have mental health issues like PTSD. As well as for the Vietnamese, the ones whose land got destroyed by the US, to this day their trees still won't grow back. Number 9. White phosphorus. Just like Agent Orange that can cause tremendous casualties, white phosphorus is prohibited as it is subjected to the international humanitarian law. It is prohibited to use white phosphorus as an incendiary weapon against civilian populations and in areas where there is a concentration of civilians. Here's why. I know it might be too graphic for our editors to put in, but as a viewer, I ask you to Google image white phosphorus burns and see why it should not be used. The issue with white phosphorus is that it makes it smoke through burning, and because they burn extremely hot, they are difficult to extinguish, which as a result we see if you look up the images why the results look like the way it does. The burning particles adhere to skin and can continue to cause damage even after the initial contact, which is why we see multiple holes burned into the skin, as white phosphorus can cause deep burns, all the way down to and even through the bone, and it can reignite even after initial treatment. So if you can imagine being dropped on this on you as a civilian and you have your family with kids, the result is tragic and inhumane. Its everlasting effects can be vile and devastating, and just like Agent Orange in Lebanon, where they got attacked with white phosphorus from the Israeli forces, who right now is still bombing Gaza with white phosphorus, the burning of the Lebanese woods and forests include more than 40,000 ancient olive trees, exacerbated the environmental impact of the conflict. Number 8. Targeting hospitals. When it comes to targeting civilians of nations when a war takes place, deliberating attacks on medical facilities and personnel depriving civilians of crucial healthcare is a war crime and an extreme punishment as a result of conflict and war. Hospitals and medical personnel are protected under international humanitarian law. Targeting hospitals and medical personnel intentionally and as strategy of war is a war crime. Additional provisions of Article 19 under the Geneva Convention still allow hospitals to be protected even if it defends itself or has small arms and ammunition taken from the wounded. In 2008, Sri Lankan armed forces have launched attacks that struck hospitals. Tens of thousands of civilians have been held hostages as shields by the armed forces, and many of the Sri Lankan armed forces unlawfully forced civilians populations along with them in retreat. When medical staff at the Valayan Madam Hospital were doing their rounds, they found themselves in the middle of an aerial attack. One aid worker noted that as they were at the hospital, they noticed drones and everyone was getting down to cover. Then a barrage of bullets came. One of the doctors who was lying next to them was killed in a shrapnel piece that hit them in the head. 4 or 5 people were killed and more than 30 were wounded in that attack. Despite these crimes that occurred in the hospitals or medical grounds, the Human Rights Watch calls all to the UN, but like as of right now, it seems like the UN does practically nothing. Number 7. Starvation and denial of humanitarian aid. The people of Gaza were cut off clean water, electricity, and access to any of the coming food by the occupying Israeli government in the early of October 2023. As of right now, there is no food in Gaza, and they're resorting to drinking salt water from the sea, as well as in order to charge their phone devices to reach out to family members or to show outreach to people what's happening in Gaza. They are charging their phones with car batteries on the roadside or trying to use solar panels that they have to get power. As of right now, over 10,000 Palestinians have died at the hands of the Israeli forces, who many of casualties are children, but that doesn't include the ones who have died of starvation, dehydration, or malnutrition. Even in a documentary born on Gaza based on the onslaught that occurred in 2014, their boats were destroyed again by Israeli forces who were only allowed to fish less than 5 miles from the land. Starvation is a tactic used constantly in wars as a way to discipline or dismantle the spirits of the people they are occupying. Humanitarian aid workers unimplemented access to populations in dire needs of states that are using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare may constitute as a war crime. And according to the IIEA, the use of starvation of civilians populations as a method of warfare is prohibited by international law. Number 6. Forced labor. Also known as slavery, as we know, consists of enslaving another person as property and ownership into bondage. And in history, my god, there were slaves everywhere. From ancient Greeks, who were known for taking prisoners of war as slaves and mistreating them as an aggressive degree as there were no laws to protect them, as well as ancient Egypt and in ancient Rome. And as we know with our modern history, slavery conducted in Latin America was an economic and social institution that existed before the colonial era. After the conquest of Latin America by the Spanish and Portuguese, of the nearly 12 million slaves that were shipped across the Atlantic, over 4 million enslaved Africans were brought to Latin America. As of today, according to the Walk Free map, an estimated 50 million people were living in modern slavery on a given day in 2021, and an increase of 10 million since 2016.